Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the basic guide to group tracks in Cubase. Group tracks are the means by which we collect like-minded audio together. So you might collect multiple different vocal lines together and route them all into a single vocal group track. We can then optionally perform processing on those group tracks rather than having to process each of the individual tracks one by one. Today I'm going to show you all the most important stuff you need to understand in order to use group tracks properly in your projects. Hope you enjoy the video, and if you do, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. It's an awesome way to help support my channel so that I can carry on making these videos. Now ultimately, the aim with this basic guide to Cubase series is that I provide a comprehensive library of all the essential functionality in Cubase, and in fact one of the videos I made recently was on templates, the basic guide to templates in Cubase, which is effectively how to set up your default start position for a song. And what you'll see here is my standard template. I'll put a link to the previous video above and in the description. But if we have a close look at this template, there are actually multiple different group tracks in use. There's one in the top panel called Master Bus, and there are 5 down at the bottom. Each of these master tracks is also a group track. If I hover over on the left-hand side with this little icon, now it's very small, quite difficult to see, but it's actually 3 faders kind of collected together into a little bucket. That's basically telling you what group tracks do. They collect together audio from multiple different sources, mix it all together, and send it on somewhere else in the project. Now, a word that you'll very often hear used in the context of group tracks is bus. And it's a kind of an unusual term when you first come across it. It doesn't seem to make very much sense. It's derived from the Latin word omnibus, which means for all, and in transport terms, it's a vehicle that's capable of delivering everybody anywhere. It's a very similar kind of concept with audio. You have this central collection point, this black box called the group track, and we can route audio into it and mix it all together and then send it on somewhere else in the project. We're going to spend a little while having a look at the standard template first because it's nice and clean and simple. And then a little bit later, I'll open one of my songs so that I can show you group tracks in use in a real world context. But let's have a look at these group tracks in the standard template and see what we can learn. Now, ultimately, all of this audio is going to get to my stereo out. This is effectively the point of contact with the outside world. This is how Cubase talks to my PC and routes the audio information to it. So ultimately, everything has to go through this stereo out track. Now, I try to keep my stereo out track as light as possible. I don't want to do any processing if at all possible. There are a couple of very minor exceptions, probably beyond the remit of today's conversation to talk about. But essentially, my stereo output is nothing more than a volume control. I'm going to do all of my audio processing on all of the tracks up to but not including this stereo output track. And this leads us very neatly on to talk about the track immediately to the left of it, the master bus. Now, you don't have to have this track in your project. It's entirely personal to me. When I load my finished song up in a little while, we'll have a look at the comparison between the master bus and the stereo out. The master bus is the only track that has direct access to the stereo out. And you can see in our routing section, just make sure you can actually see it. Here's the routing section. And the master bus is the only track that routes to the stereo output. Let's leave the master bus be for a while. It's not going to make any sense until we have a look at it in a real world context, and we're going to deal with that later. So let's jump on to the next level in the hierarchy, which is the master group tracks. And this is where, when I said we had quite a few group tracks to start with in the standard template, all of these 5 tracks at the bottom of the project are all master tracks, but they're individual instrument master tracks. So we have a single master bus, which is the master bus to rule them all, and then individual master buses for each of the instrument types, and you can see what those instrument types are. This gives me really simple, straightforward, one-stop control over the drums and the keyboards and the guitars, vocals and bass. Working backwards another step, so here we are, for instance, at the guitar master. If we step backwards out of the guitar master, we get to our individual guitar tracks. And in the routing section above, you can see mono guitar in is where I plug my guitar into my audio interface. That audio interface connects into Cubase. I'm going to be able to record information on this guitar track, which is then going to get routed to the guitar master to master bus to stereo out. So it's this kind of daisy chain effect. Let's see that in action. I'll drag some information out of Media Bay, and I'll use Media Bay because if you want to follow along with this project, you'll be able to. I'm going to pick up this Aberdeen Bridge audio, drag it onto my project, and press play. So the audio coming out of this guitar track is being routed into the guitar master. The guitar master is feeding onto the master bus, and ultimately, this is where I have overall control of the track. I get to choose the level of the audio output from my stereo out. But in addition to the guitar playing, something else is happening as well. These two tracks to the right of the guitar are called guitar delay and guitar reverb, and they also have stuff going on. If I scroll down in the mixer, you can see that I have a couple of send outputs. So my guitar track, in addition to the standard guitar sound itself with these processes on, is also outputting this audio to two separate different effects tracks, the delay and the reverb. So I've effectively made three independent audio streams. The original guitar, sure, that's feeding into the guitar master, but then I have two extra copies of the audio. One of them is going into this delay effects track, which is then going into my primal tap delay. And if we have a look at the routing in the guitar delay track, that's also routed into the guitar master. So this is where the group track is starting to earn its keep now. Multiple different audio sources are all being routed into it, and they're all being mixed together into a single audio source that's then being fed onto the master bus. So this single group track is collecting those three various audio sources together. I take all the delay and reverb away, the original source is still being fed in. There's the delay in. And there's the reverb. With the master track, I can control the sum total of audio from all of those different audio tracks. And that's being reflected in the master bus. When I turn the guitar master down, the amount of signal getting out of the guitar master is being reduced that's going into the master bus as well. I'm going to duplicate this audio track now so that it's carried across all of the insert and send effects, just hasn't carried across the audio. I'm going to reopen Media Bay, and this time I'll choose Chorus B, and I'll drag that into the new track. Let's have a look at those tracks in the mixer. Both feeding into the guitar master, the sum total output of those two guitar tracks is going to be mixed together and fed into here. Let's pan them hard left and right. So now I can control the individual levels of each of those signals, where I want them in the stereo field. All of that mixing is done at the individual track level. I want to get the audio for each of those guitar parts sounding how I want it to sound before everything is mixed together and sent into the final guitar master. I still have complete control over the total sum output of those guitar tracks from the master track. So that's the concept of group tracks dealt with from the perspective of my standard template. I'm just going to simplify everything down. So I've got rid of the effects tracks, and here's the group track being deleted. So let's create it from scratch. What I'm going to do is control click on my keyboard so that I've selected both of the guitar tracks. I'm now going to right click in the mixer and say add group channel to selected channels. So we're going to do this process manually. Now I need to give Cubase some configuration information on how to create that group track. I don't think I've ever created a group track that isn't stereo. Now it's perfectly reasonable to create audio tracks as mono if you're recording, for instance, a vocal which has a single microphone, or a guitar with a single input. Totally reasonable to use a mono track there. It helps you out with your rendering, for instance. If you render a mono track, it's going to get rendered to a mono version of that audio track. But as far as group tracks are concerned, there are very few reasons, and certainly beyond the remit of today's conversation, to not create every single one of your group tracks as stereo. As a little peek under the hood, there's a thing called down mixing in Cubase, and if you generate down mixes, you might want your group tracks to be mono, but it's an exceptionally fringe case, and I only mention it just for those curious enough to think, well, why? Why wouldn't I want to? Why would I need the option in the first place? I basically say to you, keep that stereo all of the time. You really won't go far wrong. The audio output is where I want this thing to get to eventually. Well, I'm going to create this track as guitar master. I'm recreating my guitar master track. So the ultimate destination for this track is my final master bus. So I'm going to say master bus. You create folders if you want to group audio together into kind of convenient, collapsible locations. We don't need to worry about folders today. So I'm going to say create outside a folder. I don't want it to be in a folder. And that's all we need. That's all of the configuration done. Click add track. And here's my guitar master. I'll move it down to where it should be in the ordinal position of my standard template. And if we have a look at that in the mixer, you can see here's the guitar audio routing into guitar master routes to master bus, and we've recreated that linking, that daisy chain linking that we had at the outset. A final quick word on my colour scheming just before we have a look at a finished song. I have different colour codes for my group tracks than my standard tracks, and they're basically all darker versions of the original. So here's my bass with a lighter red, and the bass master, the group track, is dark. Light pink for vocals, dark pink for vocal master. I don't actually have any keyboard plugins as part of my standard template, so there's a kind of one track missing there. Here's my drum track, which is light blue for the instrument, dark blue for the group track. After all of that's done, my red track, my master output, is my one single point of truth, and that's why master bus is coloured the same as the stereo out, because they're basically inextricably linked. I tie those two tracks together and they perform a shared duty to get the entire output of the song to the outside world. So that said, let's have a look at a finished song, and then I'll show you some real-world examples of how group tracks work. Okay, here's one of my finished songs. You can see quite a few tracks in this song and some nice examples of how I implement group tracks. So let's talk about naming convention first. I have 3 different naming convention standards for my group tracks. At the end of the chain, and you've already seen them, are the master buses, and there are only ever 6 of them in the majority of the songs that I write. Now, if I wrote a song with lots of strings, for instance, I might create a strings master, but generally speaking, I've got the overall kind of instrument collection master tracks, plus one final master bus, and that's it. Those are the only buses that ever get the word master. The other 2 words that I use are sub and bus, and they have quite different meanings, and I find the distinction between them to be really useful. A sub collects either identical or almost identical audio together from multiple different tracks and mixes them together. So we have some examples of subs in this song. I duplicated the bass line in order to apply different processing to the high frequencies and the low frequencies. It's exactly the same bass line, just going through different processes. Let's listen to either one of these lines. So there's bass low, which is basically taking care of all of the really deep, heavy stuff. Bass high has a very dramatically different EQ curve, and that's basically just adding an extra little bit of saturated fizz to the top. I then mix those 2 audio sources together into a group track called the bass sub. So it's literally just merging either, like I said, identical or almost identical. I'll show you an example of that in a little while. So now when we listen to the bass sub, you're hearing those 2 separate audio tracks together. I can then do composite processing on the bass sub. So I'm basically pretending that the bass sub is the original audio source. Here's the individual EQ processing, and there's an emulator there as well that's generating those 2 distinct sounds using the same audio file. I then mix those 2 audio sources together and combine them, and you can see me applying some. There's a compressor, for instance, the API 2500. So I'm applying processing on the sub. A sub treats that audio as if it is the original audio source, and I'm perfectly happy, for instance, to apply automation to a sub track. Let's have a look at that somewhere else in the system, in the project. Scroll down a little bit. Here's a keyboard line. Now these two audio tracks aren't actually identical. Here's one. And here's the other. They're very, very similar, but if you look at the audio files, they're not actually identical. I'm treating them as if they are identical. When they get merged together into the sub, I then behave as if those two audio files are one. And you can see I'm applying volume automation to the track. So I'm effectively using volume tailing there, just pulling the volume down so that it disappears into the mix. But I'm doing all of my processing on the subgroup itself. The other primary group naming mechanism that I use is the word bus. And a bus is a means of collecting very thematically linked information, but this time it's not identical or almost identical. Here, for instance, is my female harmony bus. Just shrunk the project down so it's a bit easier to see. You can see quite a few different female harmony lines running here. And I have control of all of that from a single harmony bus. Now, in fact, the female harmony bus for this particular song is a really good example, really good illustration of all of the concepts of group tracking. So let's stick here for a while. All of the audio coming out of all of the vocal tracks is going to get to the vocal master. We already know that. But working backwards, how do we get to the vocal master? So we have female harmonies and male harmonies. We have a female harmony bus that collects every single one of the female vocal tracks together into a single place. And here is the male harmony bus, again, taking its input from the 10 male harmony tracks. But here's an example of sub and bus being used as distinct terms. The female harmony bus is collecting all of these tracks together, and you can see at the end of the song, quite a few tracks of harmony are being played, but they're subdivided into types of sound. Now, at the end of the song, there's no vox, but that's actually sung vocals. So if I jump over here, so those 4 vocal tracks are actually singing words. Towards the end of the song, we have multiple instances of the word R being sung. So now I've just soloed the R sub. So all of these lines are really, really similar and they generate this sound. Here's the sub and the oo sub. So now that I've collected those really similar sounds together, I've got independent control of them, which means when I come to mix them together into my overall female harmony bus, I can mix and match the R's, the O's and the ums. So let's do that. So this time I'm going to solo the female harmony bus. Soloing is your friend when you're dealing with group tracks, and this is why if you have a good, well-structured grouping system, it's really easy to solo a single thing. I've just soloed the female harmony bus there, and as you can see in the project behind, I've now got all of the different female harmonies, and so I can now mix and match oohs, ums and ahs. And because I've just pulled down all 3 of those faders, you're not hearing anything at all. Wait for some oohs. There they are. So I'll generally do automation at the sub or individual level. So typically I'll apply automation to individual R tracks or to the R sub. Let's have a look at all of the automation used in this project. Fairly minimal because it was a pretty consistent kind of performance. But as you can see, a little bit of volume automation that's been applied on individual tracks. I could have done it on the sub. I could have done it on the individual tracks. They're totally fine. I'm less likely to do it on the overall buses because that's simply where everything that's already been mixed and arranged together, I've made most of my decisions before I get to my overall bus track. So typically, this is another one of these distinction points. Lots of automation generally gets done on subs because I'm treating those as real audio sources. That's where I want to do my mixing. The buses are where everything simply gets collected together and then routed onto the outside world. Generally speaking, I'm going to do less audio processing, particularly volume automation, on my buses. It's not an absolute rule, it's a heuristic. Now, I said we were going to defer talking about the master bus until we had a real world example. Well, here's my real world example, and here's the processing getting done on the master bus. So you see there's compression and EQ going on the master bus here. So here are my master bus effects. They're generally speaking all fairly minimal, but they do have an impact on the overall sound, really glues everything together. I do all of that on the master bus. This single master output set to 0 dB. This is the most important output track. The master bus is where everything gets mixed together and polished and ready to go. The only thing that would ever happen on the stereo out, and I've deleted it for the purpose of today, because it's very heavy on the CPU and I generally do tend to get rid of it, is that I will put ozone, which is the overall kind of final mastering product. I'll put that on the stereo output so that it can hear everything that's coming out of the entire song. All of that audio gets fed into ozone, and out of ozone comes a -14 LUFS overall sound that's ready for me playing on YouTube or Spotify or wherever I want to publish it. But in reality, that's just another volume control. Like I said, stereo out is purely all about volume, about controlling the overall level that's hitting the outside world. The sound processing is happening in the master track, and splitting the division of labour between those two jobs I find to be really, really useful. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.